Then David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. The time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned for 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, only he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the principal high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said to him, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Although I am only a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been before, and no one like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all your life. No other king shall compare with you. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Today we finish our saga of King David. We've been talking about King David here for the last 2-3 weeks. And we met David as a small boy, chosen by God and anointed by Samuel to be king over Israel and Judah. We heard about David and his great renown as a military leader, a musician, and a poet. We saw his rise to power after the death of Saul and Jonathan, and his collapse as he turned away from God to pursue another man's wife, and then compounded that sin by trying to cover it up by killing that woman's husband, by placing him in harm's way. And we saw and we talked about how his destructive choices changed his family tree and how it ripped his family apart. David and Bathsheba lost their first child, that child that was conceived in an adulterous relationship. And then later on, David's firstborn son was killed by another one of his sons, Absalom. And Absalom was killed after trying to rebel against his father. In fact, how many of you thought this was a Game of Thrones episode? David lived until he turned about age 70. But at that time, he was far from the king he once was. When the first book of Kings opens up, in these first 3 chapters that we hear our selections from, David is an old man. And we are told that the most beautiful virgin is found in the whole of the kingdom to come and warm the king's bed. But David never has sex with her. And so we discover that David is not only old, but he's also impotent. And he fails a crucial test for power. And after that happens, a series of events unfolds in the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings. We learn that the next prince in line, his next eldest son, the one that has not died yet, Adonijah, holds a secret meeting of his supporters to plan a coup d'etat and make himself king. Now, Bathsheba and Nathan discover Adonijah's plans, and while Adonijah and his supporters are meeting, Bathsheba and Nathan conspire to have King David declare Solomon the true heir. You see, Solomon was not the next in line to be king. Adonijah was. But Adonijah's pride and impatience and his willingness to overthrow his father Well, it kind of infuriates King David, especially when Bathsheba and Nathan are telling King David all that his eldest son is doing. Now, we get hints in the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings that David is probably starting to lose his memory and lose his mind, because Nathan and Bathsheba convince him that he had promised the palace and promised the throne to Solomon. And David goes along with it. And he declares Solomon to be his rightful heir right then and there. Heralds are sent out. Nathan brings Solomon to the center of Jerusalem. He pours oil over his head and anoints him king. The shofar is blown, which is a ram's horn, and it's blown, and everybody hears this, and including Adonijah and all the people who are gathered as they're conspiring, and they wonder what's going on. Well, the herald comes and tells Adonijah and his co-conspirators, well, David has just made your younger brother king. And so Adonijah rushes, as all of his supporters abandon him, and he rushes over to the Ark of the Covenant. He grabs hold of the corners of the Ark of the Covenant, and he declares sanctuary, because he knows that his younger brother is coming to kill him. And Adonijah is met by Solomon. Solomon says, well, as long as you don't rebel against me, and as long as you promise that you will see me as king, then I will let you live. David gives some last words to Solomon in the second half of chapter 2, including some practical advice about how to kill those people who are maybe in his way. And it's funny, David says, oh, why don't you kill my military commander, and kill so-and-so, and kill your cousin, because they're all going to try to overthrow you. Now, some historians think that this may just be a way of getting Solomon off the hook for killing all of his rivals, but maybe it's just some practical advice from David. And so if you read the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings, what you see a whole lot of is a lot of trickery and some ethical stuff that's not quite right. In fact, it's very hard to see God at work in the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings at all. It's hard to find dignity in King David's fall from power and in his failing health. But we're drawn back to faithfulness by the blessing that David gives his son, Solomon. And we hear these words in 1 Kings chapter 2. When David's time to die drew near, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of your Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. And the Lord will establish his word that he spoke concerning me. If your heirs take heed to their way to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. So despite David's feebleness, and despite David's failing health, he's still able to bless his son Solomon with the words that God gave him. And so when we rejoin the story in our scripture that we heard today, we hear that King David has died. And Solomon is declared king of all the people of God. And I wish I could say it was easy, but as I just told you, it wasn't. It was full of intrigue and murder and betrayal and lying. Now, at the beginning of chapter 3, Solomon is declared king, but the first thing he does is he goes and marries the Pharaoh's daughter. According to Mosaic law, you're not supposed to do that kind of thing. You're not supposed to marry a foreigner. We kind of don't realize that. In fact, Solomon not only marries a foreigner, the very next thing he does is he starts to build his palace. And to hedge his bets, he doesn't just worship the God of his ancestors, he worships all the gods. He goes to every high place, on every high mountain with their own idol, and he goes to worship all of those gods too. And so we kind of miss out on that when we hear the scripture beginning in verse 3 of chapter 3. See, Solomon is not a perfect man in the same way that Saul was not a perfect man and David was not a perfect man. But the focus of our scripture today, where we enter the story today, is not on how good Solomon was, but how good God is to continue to reach down to the heir of David. Solomon, despite the ethically ambiguous way that he rises to power, despite the work that his mother and the prophet Nathan do to undermine a rightful prince's claim to the throne, despite the brutality Solomon has in dispatching all of his rivals, well, we kind of learn that maybe he's learned something important. He's learned that to rule, he needs to have the blessing of God. David gave him these words on the deathbed, saying, obey God, obey the Mosaic law. And so Solomon is faithful, but he happens to hedge his bets and is faithful to everybody. Selfish, but faithful. And God appears to him in a dream, and God says to Solomon, ask what I should give you. And Solomon replies, give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people? And Solomon's request for wisdom to discern between right and wrong, we come full circle back to the beginnings of the Jewish people as they're entering into the land of Canaan after the period of Moses and the period of Joshua. You see, after the Jewish people settled in that land, they sought out judges to provide wise counsel. When they saw how kings in other lands could bring even more power and more riches to their people, they sought out a king. Samuel warns them, saying, you get a king, you're just going to take. And we had that happen in Saul and David, right? We learn that Saul takes everything he wants, David takes everything he wants. And it makes you wonder, why are the people wanting a king? But here they finally have a promise of a king that's not just going to take what he wants, but is going to people in a wise way. And as the story goes on, the Lord blesses Solomon. He gives him the gift of wisdom. But not only that, he provides Solomon with power and riches and honor and a long life, as long as Solomon remains faithful to God. The writers of the story about Solomon are teaching us, who are the hearers of the story, that we don't have to be perfect to receive God's grace. Solomon is still blessed. And for the most part, we learn that Solomon does well as a king, ruling over his people for 40 years and building the temple that housed the Ark of the Covenant. But immediately after his death, the United Kingdom falls apart. His sons all fight with one another, and the line of David seems to fracture. And just a couple hundred years later, the temple is destroyed as the Babylonians exile them. And the lesson of the Old Testament from this point forward is that human beings continue to fail to be obedient to God. And they are always searching for the restoration of what once was. As the prophets write about the future, they are always keeping in mind the past ways that God has interacted with them. And they keep on saying, we humans fail. The Jewish people once had great kings. They had successful kings, wise kings, and rich kings. And yet even that splendor did not keep them from destruction. People are still selfish, and they're still full of anger and pride, and they're lustful and jealous. And so as Christians, we're left to wonder, why do we hear these stories of the Old Testament? What do we learn from this for ourselves? And you see, when we only hear part of the story, when we only hear the part about Solomon asking for wisdom and getting it and being blessed, well, we may fall into a false comfort that God's going to bless us as long as we ask. And that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that God continues to reach out to us even in the midst of our failures. When we only hear about the blessing, maybe we are reminded of that story about a wanderer in the desert who finds a lamp and rubs the lamp, and the genie comes out and we are offered 3 wishes. Anybody watch Aladdin back in the 90s? Love Robin Williams and that. And maybe as a child you played that game you play after you hear that story and said, what would you wish for? What are the things we wish for? Money, power, love, health, and what's the most important thing? 3 more wishes, right? Unfortunately, God is not a bubble gumball machine that we put our quarter in and get a prize. Wouldn't it make humanity a whole lot different if, and a whole lot more fun if we were all given one wish that we could redeem at any point in our life. Kind of a get out of jail free card. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Instead, what we're given is an opportunity for faithfulness in this life. We are taught the ways of God. We are taught the ways of God by our family, by our church. We learn the lessons of God's faithfulness to us and our failure to be obedient as we read the scriptures. But we also learn what it means to be a good human being and to do our best to love God and love our neighbors. What we learn from Solomon and from David and even Saul is that we all fail, right? Even God's most blessed people, the people who are seen as the leaders of the golden age of Israel. And keep in mind, the golden age of Israel lasted about 80 years. 80 years. David ruled for 40. Solomon ruled for 40. And then that period of history is gone. We all go the way of the earth, and even the greatest can fall. Even though Solomon was the wisest man to ever live, he wasn't perfect. He had knowledge, but his human wisdom couldn't keep him from making mistakes. And in fact, I'm not going to get into it, but any man who has to marry 600 women and have 300 concubines probably has made some mistakes along the way. Now, a lot of those are probably for treaties and whatever, but still, many of us wrestle to deal with one relationship in our life, don't we? We are offered grace. That's the other gift we are given as Christians. Our story, our own story, our personal story doesn't mean that, it doesn't include the promise that we'll become king one day or queen one day. Our story probably does not include slaying giants or being great military leaders. But our story, our human story, includes interactions with other people, relationships with other people. As Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ surpassed Solomon in all his wisdom. And in fact, a lot of New Testament scholars love to point out all the places where the ancient words of wisdom in Proverbs and in the Songs of Solomon and in other places in Ecclesiastes, how some of that language is appropriated by the New Testament, by the Gospels. And instead of wisdom being praised, instead it's Jesus. Even the earliest Christian writers place Jesus in the role of wisdom. We are shown over and over again Jesus' ability to discern the truth in any situation. We see it when Jesus challenges the false hearts of the Pharisees when they argue about the law with Jesus and have no compassion in their heart for people in need. We see it in Jesus healing on the Sabbath to prove the point that rules aren't more important than people. We see it in Jesus telling those about to stone a woman to death that they can only do so if there is no sin in their own lives. Jesus demonstrated wisdom that can get us out of all the complex situations we get ourselves wrapped in. Jesus said it simply to us. Love God and love others, but it's not an easy thing to do, is it? Can I hear an amen to that? I mean, if our commandment is to love, we fail. Or maybe we need to have a few more words. Maybe we need to take what the Apostle Paul says and says, put aside your anger and your jealousy and your conflict and instead embrace the fruits of the Spirit. Love and joy and peace, patience, kindness and goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The Old Testament stories remind us that God demands our faithfulness. But we are taught by the New Testament that God's grace will meet us no matter how hard we try. You see, that's what the story about Jesus is about, is that Jesus reaches down to us no matter where we are in our life to lift us up even higher. Solomon, David, Saul, Moses, Joshua, Noah, none of these great Jewish leaders were saints. They were all imperfect human beings. And perhaps that's the greatest message that we can gain from the study of these Old Testament figures, both men and women, who we hear the stories about. Because if they struggled, if they were these people who were blessed by God and chosen by God struggled, well, there's hope for us. We're just mere mortals in God's creation. Amen.
Amen.
I would like to say we were going to sing our last song, but I have no voice today. So instead, let us say a prayer. Gracious and loving God, be with us today as we go out into this world, and allow us to love others as you have first loved us. And Lord, in our failures, continue to reach towards us and lift us up. Amen.
Amen.